Hey, everybody. Today's guest has a great story. Matt Jones is one of the co founders of Four Pillars Gin, a brand that went from a dream in Australia to one of the most celebrated craft spirits in the world. Matt and his two co founders built something extraordinary from scratch, and then they were able to sell the business to complete their success story. But here's what I love about Matt's journey. He'll be the first one to tell you that he was an accidental entrepreneur. He first was an economist, then a political speechwriter, then a brand strategist. And all of these experiences set him up for his journey into the world of making gin, something he knew nothing about. But he did understand calculated risks and believed that building something you loved with people you trust and surviving the years when no one's watching can lead to a success story. This one is rich with lessons that we can all learn from as we sit down with Matt Jones. I have a lot of questions for you. You've done a lot of different things. We're going to talk about the gin company, of course, but you've done a lot of different things. And I wonder, just off the top, you're an entrepreneur. What do you think is the biggest risk you've taken in your life, whether it's professional or personal? Because part of your success is definitely taking risks, I believe.
Look, maybe. I don't know if risk-taking contributed to the success or not. I always say I was an accidental entrepreneur. I don't think I was born particularly with the sort of entrepreneurial gene. I stumbled into making gin, and I'm sure we'll talk about how that stumbling in happened and where it led. Probably the biggest risk I've taken in my career was really to trash a career I had in service of a life. When I was in my 20s, I was building really quite an interesting and successful career in the world of politics in the UK. And
Okay.
I'd met an Australian girl who became my Australian girlfriend and now my Australian wife. And we lived in London. We got married in London, and we were both really enjoying life and work there. But we decided ultimately that we wanted long-term life to be in Sydney. And with no jobs and no prospect of really transferring the careers we'd built in the UK over to Australia, we decided to make the move and I guess prioritize life and prioritize how we wanted to be in the world, and then trust that work and possibility would show up. And that was probably the scariest risk we took, because we
Hmm.
handed back something we'd built and in return got nothing other than, a blank sheet. But it was a blank sheet in a place we wanted to be. So that notion of just sort of trusting, not just trusting instinct, but getting your values right and getting the hierarchy of things that were important to you right. That was probably the biggest risk I've taken. By contrast, when we started the gin business, there was risk there, but there was also a little bit of security behind that. And I guess
Yeah.
we'll touch on that as we go.
Yeah, that's interesting because I think as we get older, it's easier to look back and say, don't be afraid to take that leap like you did. But when you're on that track, I think it's harder to do that. So it's easier said than done, I think, for most people, especially when you're climbing that corporate ladder or on the track like you were. So it's easier to probably say it now at my age as I'm older, but encourage people to do that. But you did it, and I think that's commendable, and people can learn from that.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think maybe sometimes you don't appreciate what you are risking in those moments as
Yeah,
well. I think, I
yeah,
don't know about you, but I find as I get older, I probably become more fearful and more anxious, not less. I think
sure.
maybe that's a common trait as we age. So you look back, you're like, what the hell were you doing? Like, it's kind of like, okay, this is what I'm doing. And maybe that's the job of our parents when we're younger, to be that kind of voice at
Yeah,
age. So yeah,
yeah.
serious, we're doing this.
So you jumped continents around a little bit. So if you could just give the quick history on the movements you made before we get to the gin company, because you were in London, you obviously spent time in New York, which the marketing firm, which I think certainly had an impact on you. So and then there was this political piece. So kind of walk us through the resume, if you will, as we do to build up to getting back to Australia.
Yeah. Let's talk about the resume through the lens of risk, because I think it's a really nice frame that you've started this whole conversation with, because I think at every stage the risk I've taken has been choosing to do something without really knowing what it leads to next.
Mm.
So, I finished high school, and I had this fascination with the newest subject that had come up on my radar. It only came up really in the last couple of years of high school, and I got really fascinated by economics. And I don't think I thought for a second, am I going to be a successful economist? Am I going to be a microeconomic genius? Am I going to be a macroeconomic theorist? I'm like, no, I just find this interesting. So I head off to university and I study economics. And of course, 3 more years of economics. One thing I'm really certain of is I'm not a good economist. Like, that is interesting, but this is not my gift to the world,
Yeah.
but it's what I've studied. And one of my professors tipped me off and said, look, I'd love to put you forward for a role in London. And it turned out he was a talent spotter for the Government Economic Service, which is the fast stream track, but for specialist economists into the UK government civil service. So I go for an interview, I get offered a job, and then I find out afterwards the job I've been offered is in military intelligence. So
Mm.
I go in as an economic analyst, but into the world of defense intelligence and military intelligence, which was utterly fascinating, utterly terrifying. I'm completely unqualified, but I'm, in these rooms with all these sort of enormously informed and intelligent people, and trying to find my feet and trying to find something I can do to add some value. After a period there, I moved into the Treasury, the finance ministry, effectively in the UK, and my remit across both of those roles was really to study the economies of foreign powers, particularly foreign powers that were of interest, not always for good reasons. So foreign powers like Russia and
Mhm.
China,
Mm.
and it's really obvious to me pretty early in that sort of first arc of my career that I am much better at talking about stuff and writing about stuff and operating in meeting rooms and making sense of what we're talking about than doing the deep economic analysis. I'm not the technical guy, I'm not the expert, but I'm pretty good at communicating it. And I don't think I'd quite wrapped that up as a frame by then, but
Mhm.
that clarity was emerging. Fast forward a couple of years, having taken a couple of detours for life, including spending some time down here in Australia, um, I moved from the civil service, working for the government, into politics, and I become a political advisor, and I become a speechwriter and a campaign strategist. And then again, without learning the language of brand, I'm starting to add a second sort of string to my bow, which is this realization that in politics, as in business, as in life, people talk a very rational game. They say they're going to vote Republican or vote Democrat because they've analyzed the policies and they've thought about what's best for their country and their families. But the truth is, we vote based on what we feel,
Mhm.
and you sit in focus groups and you'll press them and press them and they'll say things like, you know what, I just don't like the way Greg looks. Matt sounds.
Yeah.
I could having a beer with the two of them. I'm not going to vote for them. Human beings are fundamentally irrational creatures. So if you add up those two sort of early experiences, I've really learned that maybe I'm not an economist, maybe I'm a storyteller, and maybe the world isn't as rational as we think it is. Maybe actually most decisions are driven by some combination of rational analysis and emotional instinct. And this was all a really good sort of warm up when I made that leap out of politics and came to Australia and didn't know what to do in my life, and spent 6 pretty miserable months working in back in actually Australian government as a communications advisor, and it was fine. It paid the bills, and I got a job in a brand agency, and it happened to be a US based brand marketing agency called Jack Morton
Mhm.
Worldwide, and Jack Morton was part of the now no longer with us Interpublic Group, one of the world's big agency holding companies who've recently been absorbed into another big agency holding company to create an even bigger one.
Mhm.
And Matt Morton was a pretty fascinating old, I don't mean that in a like, sort of 60, 70-year-old company that had grown up in the world of event marketing, had grown up in the 20th century world of big conferences and trade shows and expos, and this realization, particularly in the B2B space, particularly in the business to business marketing space, that business is personal and it's relationship driven and it's about bringing people together. But what was changing when I joined Jack Morton in 2006 was the world of consumer brand building, the way that brands connected with consumers, the
Mm.
old 20th century model of Matt and Greg are sitting at home watching Cheers along with about a quarter of the American population or a quarter of the British population. I grew up going to school and I come home and we'd watch a TV show called Neighbours. It was this like terrible soap opera from
Mhm.
Australia. About 20 million people in a population at the time of 60 million watched that crappy
Wow.
Australian soap opera every day. We used to live in a very simple world. If Matt and Greg wanted to build a brand and tell people about it, we probably had three, four, five main linear TV channels we could advertise in. We
Mm.
had major national or state level newspapers we could advertise in. We had magazines for people of that specialist interest that had really broad reach and distribution. By 2006, that world is fracturing and fragmenting.
Yeah.
Audience splintering in a million different directions, and advertisers and brand builders are really trying to figure out, how do I connect with people? How do I engage my target audience? How do I build community? How do I tell my stories? And so that was the world that I found when I joined Jack Morton. And we at Jack Morton were going, well, we're really experts in this world of live experience and bringing people together. Maybe we've got something to offer in this new world of brand building. And then, of course, in 2007, Steve Jobs holds up the iPhone.
Mhm.
8, 9, 10, most of us get our first Facebook accounts, and we sort of tip into that next decade, the 2010s, and this explosion of social media, social commerce, direct consumer brands popping up everywhere. And those tools of brand experience can suddenly be amplified by social media and amplified by a connected digital landscape. And the whole world of marketing and brand building changes. So I feel enormously lucky that I dropped into the world of agencies at a time when the rules for building brands were changing. And I
Yeah.
had I had a baby in New York. She's now 16, which dates me enormously. Um, we decided to come back to Australia. And in amongst a few different things, I meet the two guys I go on and found Four Pillars with, and we can talk about that gin journey. But the great fortune I had at the start of that was to have been sort of had the, if you like, been exposed to the light of this new way of thinking about brand building and thinking about connecting with people. I'd had this education, this accidental education in storytelling, in strategy, in political persuasion, in really the primary understanding of what brand and influence is all about. And then I'd got to experience and test theories in that crucible of this new communications landscape. And then I get to make some gin and do something with all that knowledge.
Yeah. That is a great summary because in reading about you and understanding your history, it seems, they're different careers, right? Economist, brand development, government affairs, and then entrepreneur. But the through line, you just connected it all. But there's a through line there, which is understanding human behavior partially, right? And then flowing into brand development. So there really is that through line really sets you up for that leap into, the entrepreneur that eventually became helping start the gin company.
100%. And I think all of us, we're sort of on, it's not that we're on trains, but all of us, we're on this sort of twin little pair of tracks. And one track is, if you like, is our personal track of the narrative and the understanding, the self-understanding of what are we doing and what capability are we building. And the other is, how are we deploying that? And so, as you say, sort of your resume is almost this track of like, well, I was an economist, I wasn't very good, but that gave me the chance to leap into politics, and I understood this, and I went into brand. But the other is, but what is the consistency? What is
Mhm.
the expertise that you are bringing? What's the special sauce that you're cooking up there? And for me, it's always been this effort to try and be clear. And I think clarity is an incredibly underrated, undervalued thing. And you can walk into a room where you are clearly not the smartest person in the room. You are clearly not the most technically expert in the room. And you can go, well, what value can I add in this room? And something my dad always drummed into me was this importance of just thinking about, like, when you walk into the room, what value walked into the room with you? What value
Yeah.
did you? And for me, one of those things I felt I could bring was clarity to the situation. And then as my sort of experience developed, the particular lens of clarity I tried to bring was, what is the story we're trying to tell here? And how is that story going to make people feel? And how is that story going to influence how those people behave? And then as I spent more time at Jack Morton, I started to shift that lens on story from what story are we telling to what experience are we going to give people so they go away and tell the story we would like them to tell. Because it turns out the really powerful stories in the world aren't the ones that we tell, they're the ones we inspire other people to tell
Hmm.
about. So those lenses and those sort of tools of clarity and story and experience are really what I've then tried to carry with me. And you sort of have to make sense of it a bit yourself and then seek out. It's like going to the gym, like you seek out and more opportunities to build those muscles and build those capabilities. But yeah, that's sort of been I guess the capability through line,
Yeah.
while as the actual places I've had the opportunity to sort of apply those skills and learn those skills, they have been quite divergent places. And sometimes those leaps have seemed quite counterintuitive, but I think there has been a capability through line
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay, so you end up back in Australia, and then I believe when you come back, you start. Is it your own consulting firm? And to take us to, you connect with your what became your two partners on this gin idea.
Yeah, it's something I've always encouraged people to do when they head into a job interview, and now it's sort of more important than ever because everyone is worried about their personal brand, and everyone's a LinkedIn influencer now and all these things.
Mhm.
So always think about, what's your narrative? What's your narrative? What's your point of view? What's your perspective on what is happening in the world? So, go to a job interview. Don't just answer the question. Talk about how you see the world. And
Mm.
the way that I saw the world when I moved back from New York was I'd become really, really convinced that we now lived in a world where the 20th century model, that you could advertise mediocrity to success. You could make a 6 out of 10 product, but be a 10 out of 10 marketer of that product and grow a global business. I
Mhm.
felt that for the most part, and mostly, thank goodness, that world was behind us. And we were now in a world where you got the success you deserved to an extent. And we'll talk about the to an extent in a minute.
Mhm.
That broadly speaking, quality rose to the top because consumers had more power to research, to choose, more ability to go into the long tail of possibility and find the thing that was just right for them, but also more power to be noisy and giving bad reviews to things that disappointed them,
Right.
and all of that stuff. And so when you followed those threads through, you went, summarize it, experiences are going to matter more than ever. The experiences that business provide to their customers are going to be the defining things. They're going to be the core source of differentiation. So then you looked at the work that I'd been doing at Jack Morton, and looking predominantly, we were working for marketing clients, marketing managers, marketing directors. And you went, well, they're responsible for about 20% of the experiences that these brands provide to their customers. But if we were talking about an airline, well, most of the experiences that matter, the planes, their on time performance, the comfort of the seats, the reliability of the in flight entertainment, the quality of the food, the quality of the frequent flyer program, and
Mhm.
how well appointed the lounges are, and all these things, they're not the responsibility of marketing. They're the responsibility of people across customer service and customer experience and product and the operational leadership. Those experiences are the consequences of financial decisions. They're the consequences of decisions that the CEO is guiding. So wait a minute, if I really believe that what matters most is all of business decision making, then I can't just be working for a consultancy that's focused on serving marketing departments. So I did two things. One, consciously, which was I set up a little consultancy focused on brand strategy and brand purpose, but designed to work for CEOs and founders as the
Mhm.
custodians of brand, and saying respectfully, marketers, you have a role to play, but you can't own the brand because the brand is so much more than what you can influence.
Mhm.
And then the accidental thing I did is I became a co-founder and a CEO myself, and got to sort of put my money and my opinions where my mouth was. But yeah, that was really the play when I came back from Australia, which was how do I try and play a small part in elevating this brand experience conversation from the marketing suite up to the C-suite.
And that's the value you brought to this new venture, right? I mean, I think your 2 partners, they were more of the were they more of the gin guys and you were, the strategy, the brand strategy and that arm of it?
Lots of answers to that. So the short answer is yes. They were the experienced gin connoisseurs, drinkers in every sense. I was the amateur. I was the guy who was still drinking, Jack Daniels and Coke, and
Yeah.
they were the ones who were, having their fourth dirty martini. Like they both knew their way around the wine industry, the spirits industry. They had an enormous amount of knowledge both on the production side and the trade and industry side. I should also say, Stu and Cam, I could not. I could enter the lottery every day for the rest of my life. I wouldn't find better or more serendipitous co-founders because also just enormous intelligence and creativity
Mhm.
and commercial savvy. So I would never say I was the only or best marketing brain in the room or strategy brain in the room. But I think what I did was I sort of held a couple of particular lenses or tools that I was able to bring to the party. First of all, I said earlier, in this new world, you got the success you deserved mostly.
Mm.
And I think in many ways, my job was to deal with the mostly bit because what I was really confident about from the very beginning was that Stu and Cam were going to be responsible for making an exceptional product, exceptional liquid. And we can talk in a second about positioning and how do you know if there's an opportunity
Mhm.
and when you take that risk and you roll the dice on something, you go, well, I don't know if anyone's going to want this yet. But the thing I had real confidence about is these two people are going to help make sure we make something really exceptional. That still will not be enough. Even in this socially connected world, this world of long tails and discovery, we still have to make sure that whatever our craft is, whatever our source of excellence is, we have to make sure we get the credit we deserve for that. And that is going to be a consequence of the stories we tell, the way we lean into design, into experiences, the way we engage people, the way we make them feel, the way we take care of every moment and every interaction. This stuff does not happen by chance. And so,
Yeah.
really, the world of building a great brand is an and. It is not a choice. It is not a choice between product excellence and marketing excellence. It is a decision that you are going to be uncompromising and committed to both sides of that. So, really, my job was to be the person who sort of constantly waved the flag and held the microscope over how are we building the strongest possible brand with our consumers, while Cameron was focused on making the best possible gin we could, and Stu was really focused on building the deepest relationships with the drinks trade, the retailers, the bartenders, the influencers. All of us thought about everything, but we all had a particular perspective that we had to anchor to.
Were you confident that you could make that connection with the consumer, that emotional connection, right? To get them invested in your product? Because it's, I mean, that's what you're talking about, right? Is you got to get buy-in from them, perhaps on an emotional level, whether they know it or not, to buy into this brand, to break in. Did you see opportunity there? Did you have confidence that you could do that?
I think all three of us, in our own ways, we are natural storytellers, and interested in storytelling. And um, I think there was a personal level of confidence that we could do something and tell engaging stories about it. Whether we had the confidence that those stories would then create that powerful emotional connection, as we talk about, sometimes it's less about whether you have confidence in that and simply the fact that you know that has to happen. So if we take a step back, and I love the name of the podcast. I love this idea of paying your dues. It sort of
Mhm.
speaks to me about this notion that we have to recognize there will be pain. There will be blood. There
Yeah.
will be, and if frankly, and this is something Scott Galloway, the prolific marketing professor
Yeah.
and podcaster in the States, talks about a lot. If we haven't found a painful problem to solve, if we haven't found something difficult that we're going to, get around and climb over, or a wall we're going to knock down, then we're just doing something that anyone could do.
Mhm.
We've not really, strategy is not about finding the cheat code or finding the shortcut. It's finding the difficult thing that we are willing and able to do that other people are not willing or not able to do. So if you look at the world of gin, one of the things I talk to people about a lot is if you're starting something, it is overwhelmingly likely that you don't really have an idea. Probably what you have on your hands is a decision. When Greg decides one day to create a podcast, the big thing that Greg's got is not a big idea. There's a
Mhm.
lot of podcasts out there. What Greg's got on his hands is a decision. I want to make a podcast. And then the question is, how do we make that decision good? Well, what's it going to be about and who's it going to be for? Am I going to get good guests on or whatever it is? But the first thing that Greg's really done is make a decision. That's what we did making gin. We
Yeah.
didn't have a big idea. People have been distilling juniper for 300 years. Mr. Gordon of Gordon's Gin
Yes.
had an idea to make gin. He stole the idea from the Dutch. They made a spirit called Kennever. We just made a decision. We're going to make some gin in Australia. So then you've got to figure out, well, why is this a good decision? And a different way of looking at that is, well, why is this decision going to be really hard to turn into success? And it turns out there's some really simple and profound reasons. Australia is a relatively small country. Um, we pay, in this relatively small country of 25 million people, we pay the second highest tax rate on
Mm.
spirits.
Mm.
So a bottle of Four Pillars sold in a wine store in Los Angeles, we would probably send about $1 to the tax man. That same bottle in Australia, we'd send about $25 to the
Wow.
tax. So you then think about, okay, well, we're going to try and create something in the craft space, in the super premium space. So everything about our brand is going to be expensive. We're going to have to buy a beautiful Rolls Royce gin making machine from a company called Christian Karl in Germany, and that's going to be expensive. We're going to have to source great botanicals from around the world. We're going to want a beautiful custom bottle. Everything we do is going to be expensive and premium. So we're going to dig a big hole, and then we've got to try and recoup that. But every time we're trying to recoup it, we're sending most of those limited sales to that small population and going back to the tax man. It's going to be really difficult to climb out of that hole that we dug, let alone turn that into a business that makes any money. Okay, well, how are we going to solve that? And we realized we had to be building a brand that could achieve craft at scale. So it had to be an exportable brand. It had to be a brand, and we're now in 30 markets worldwide. It also had to be a brand that could command significant margins. Well, the best margins are on direct sales, direct consumer. So
Mm.
we're going to be a brand that's going to invest and build our own home, like a beautiful distillery destination. We now have 200,000 people visit Four Pillars every year and come and taste and drink and have a good time and walk away with bags full of gin. That's much better margin than you get selling through a third-party retailer. And also, we have to master this new world of social media and e-commerce and drive direct sales, direct website sales. And so we actually launched the brand before we'd even made our third bottle of gin through crowdfunding, traditional crowdfunding, no equity, just pure pre-sale, the old
Wow.
school way.
Yeah.
300, 307 people pledged to buy a bottle of gin and put money in the bank before we'd made it. Now, that raised about $30,000, which was a drop in the ocean compared to the close to $1 million startup costs of getting this off the ground. But it did two things. It gave 300 people the feeling that they had helped to contribute the startup capital, that they were now part of this story. But,
Yes.
but, but maybe even more important, it taught us from the very beginning that we have to engage people emotionally. So coming back to your question,
Mhm.
it wasn't a question of can we, it was a challenge of we must.
Mhm.
Like we're gonna launch this business that will only be successful if we can get people to visit us, if we can get people to subscribe to our emails, if we can get people to follow us on social media. The old way of building a spirits brand, which is that Matt and Greg decide we're going to create a funky little American rye whiskey, and we're just going to approach the cool bars and the cool bartenders and try and get it on the back bar, hope consumers see it. And over time, that's not going to work.
Mhm.
We go straight to consumers. We have to engage them, you know, head and heart. We're going to have to get them invested, not just in the flavor of the gin, but the story, the purpose, the mission, that sense of help us build something incredible in Australia. We've got to leverage every possibility. It wasn't a question of can we, it was a absolute imperative of we must. And that was the way that we launched, and that was the way we continued. On the one hand, trying to make the most interesting creative gins we could in the world, and we ended up being named the world's best gin producers 3 times. But on the other hand, never discounting the importance of helping people taste the gin before they'd even got a bottle in their hands. That sense that through storytelling and through photography and through film and through experience, through aesthetics and design and language, people just wanted to walk towards the gin. They had to buy another bottle. They had to,
Yeah.
even though they unopened bottles on their shelf behind them, and that particularly happened through all the lockdowns of COVID, that we would keep making limited editions and interesting things. They're like, I don't need it, but I want it. And so that 2 engines of quality and craft, but also brand and emotion and story, we just had to keep those 2 engines spinning in parallel at all times.
So you get that initial 30,000 and you get enough to make your first batch. Do you remember what it felt like to, I guess, live with that uncertainty, right? We know the story, how the story ends, right? It's a happy ending, but there must have been times where you were talking to your wife like, "Hey, we rolled the dice. I hope this works." What did that feel like? And do you remember moments like that in the building of this thing?
Look, I do. I mean, I vividly remember that the week that we officially launched the product onto market, so it was December of 2013, we had successfully completed the crowdfunding campaign. That had actually created incredible momentum in some of our conversations with small scale investors and with the trade, because even though it was only 307 people, suddenly people a little bit distant from it went, oh, okay, there's something here. Like
Mm,
these these three bald middle aged blokes who I thought didn't have a clue have just managed to convince people to buy a gin that doesn't exist yet. Okay, there's
yeah,
something going on. Anyway, a couple of months later, it's December. We launched Four Pillars onto the market. We run events in Adelaide, at Brisbane, at Sydney, and Melbourne. And that very same week, we had an offer accepted on a house, and I had 2 small children. And I look back and go, gosh, that must have been stressful, and
yeah.
although it didn't feel so much at the time, and it's really informed something I've thought about a lot. And I won't take too big a detour here, but I'll take a tiny, tiny detour.
Let's do it.
I I talked about trying to figure out what is going to be difficult about this, because if we can find the difficult thing, we can find the thing that we're going to succeed at that other people haven't. Warren Buffett, the great investor, would call that a moat. We have a moat in business because we've got over something hard to get over. One of the things that became very clear to us is this is going to be a cash hungry business. And we want to build a long term, super premium luxury brand, call it what you will. This is going to be expensive. If we are starving for cash, if we are cash strapped, if we are concerned about our cash position from the very beginning, we will make decisions that are directly at tension with
Yeah,
that need to be a luxury brand. We will start discounting. We will start running promotions. And that is not the path to aspiration and luxury that we want to walk. So we did something that, in hindsight, feels really quite bold, but we valued the business at zero. We didn't have some hubristic valuation. We said, okay, well, let's start with the proposition that this business is worth nothing because we have no big idea.
yeah,
We're just 3 guys who want to make gins. Why is that valuable? It's not. And then we're each going to put in a bit of money, and we're going to say we're going to match that money dollar for dollar with sweat equity, which everyone listening to this would be familiar with the principle. So we're going to put in a little bit of money and a little bit of hustle. And then we're going to invite 20 people to buy 2% each of the business. So at launch, we 3 co-founders only owned 20% of the business each. And then
mm,
we had many friends and family who had each put in a bit of cash to buy a 2% stake. Now, that did two things. It created a level of, I guess, what sort of entrepreneurs would call dilution from the beginning. A lot of people listening to this might be thinking about something entrepreneurial. I'm thinking, I want to own 100% of my business. But 100% of a business that's got no money in the bank, doesn't have great prospects, and where every decision you make and every risk you take is on you, I would rather own 20% of a business that had some liquidity, had some guts, had some people cheering it on from the sidelines. And so the reason I raised that is your question was about that sense of, balancing on the high wire and looking down and going, oh shit, we're up in
Hmm.
there and there's risk here. And how's that feel? And there was that. But equally, we had designed to make sure that that risk didn't feel too risky. So we had, none of us were finance people, but we had enough commercial acumen to plot out a 2-year budget and go, right, this is the money we've raised through investment. This is the money that we've put in ourselves. There was another safety net. Stu and I were both running our own agencies. Stu was running a PR and communications firm, public relations firm. I was running my brand consultancy. We both committed that those businesses were going to keep paying us. We were not going to take a dollar out of Four Pillars in the first
Hmm.
instance. Cameron was the guy who was going to make the gin. He was the one who was going to upend his life to do that. So, okay, we better pay Cameron
Yeah.
because if Cameron goes under a truck, we're in trouble. Stu
Hmm.
and Matt keep doing other things. So we kept the burdens on the business light. We kept the cash where it was working hardest in production, in quality, and in limited investments in brand and in getting Cameron in the business. So we built a business plan and we went, okay, we're not going to run out of money for 2 years. And so then what made us calm very quickly was we did better in the crowdfunding campaign than we expected. We sold more gin in the first month than we expected. There was then a typhoon in the South China Seas, and all of our custom glass that was coming from China got delayed. And so we had to spend money air freighting enough bottles to deal with the first couple of batches because we were batch distilling everything. And so then we spent a bit more money than we expected. But once the rest of the glass arrived and we were able to start restocking customers, once again, our sales exceeded expectations. And so at every stage early on, we're looking at the budget, we're looking at the money in the bank, and we're looking at our sales and brand performance and going, we're ahead of schedule. So the only thing we started to lose sleep over was, hey, we thought we had enough money for 2 years. We're going to run out of money in 18 months, but we're going to run out of money because we are growing twice as fast as we expected. And that is a relatively easy story to
Hmm.
take back and say, do you want to tip a little bit more in? Because actually, we've got this fire started. Let's chuck a bit more fuel on. And so, of course, your question is correct. Of course, there is a sense of jeopardy and fear and these moments where you go, oh my gosh, we have really risked a lot. And there are certainly moments where things go wrong, whether it's a typhoon in the South China Seas or simply, unexpected things and customers don't pay invoices or whatever. But on the whole, I think we had designed for um, we designed to give ourselves the breathing space to play a long game, to
Hmm.
play brand building and to play a long game of riding out some of those short-term bumps. And so then you're looking at the indicators. And the indicators are, wait a minute, we thought we'd sell this much gin in the first month, and we've sold 2x that. We thought we'd sell this much gin in the first quarter, we've sold 2.5x that. We thought a few people would take notice. We've actually already got this many customers. We thought we'd build this social community. We've already got this many people following us and reordering on our website. So when all those indicators are green, and you've designed for long termism, it allows you to feel a little bit calmer in what is inevitably the choppy seas. And it also helps you place things in perspective because early success is small. It's not going to be big. And you have to give yourself permission to be excited by small numbers. So instead of going, oh my God, I've thought about, our break even point, and our break even point will be when we're selling 100,000 bottles of gin a year. Yeah, okay, but you need to celebrate when you hit 1,000 bottles a year.
Yeah.
And so having a plan and understanding what is the timescale to success, what is the path to success, and do we have the funding so that we can stay in the game long enough to be
Right.
successful? Those things help keep you calm, and maybe ride out those moments of inevitable anxiety and self doubt that we
Yeah.
all have.
That feels like such a critical point in this story that that decision to take that equity, or give up that equity. Um, I think it's. I heard Mark Cuban say, would you rather own 30% of a watermelon or 100% of a grape, right? Like what's bigger? And it feels like that's a decision every entrepreneur has to make at some point. Is like when are they going to give up that equity? But sounds like you guys made an early decision that that cash position in giving up that equity sets you up for success, and that feels like a key decision.
100%. And Cuban, as so often, Cuban is wise, and um, equity is often the most valuable currency that you have to spend in the early days. If
Hmm.
you're setting up a business as a solo founder, I would never do that. Like I've set up little consultancies and things on my own, but a real business that makes stuff and does stuff and has to be out in the world, do that as a team. Go and
Yeah,
find some fellow travelers, and find fellow travelers who have hopefully a perfect combination of just enough overlap in the Venn, but a big enough part of the Venn diagram that is the bit that they can own. And that's a really lovely thing. You don't want to be standing on top of each other, but equally you don't want to be from Mars and Venus and unable to communicate. So find some fellow travelers, do that. By contrast, going, oh, wait a minute, I'm no good at marketing. I need to bring in a really senior marketing director and pay them a senior marketing director salary. You don't have that money. Find out if they've got the real appetite and the hustle. Offer them
yeah,
equity, not cash. That's
right.
the thing to spend. So worry less about dilution and worry more about whether you're building a watermelon or a grape
Yeah.
as Cuban. So that's a philosophical point. But if we go from philosophy to strategy, I think what is so often missing for and I'm not just saying this about startup entrepreneurs, I think this is missing, frankly, for a lot of CEOs, are two interlocking theories. And I call them the theory of business growth and the theory of brand growth. And really what we need to get clear on is this back and forth between what is the business we're trying to build? What is how do we quantify our ambition? So, you're looking at four pillars and you're going, well, what level of scale do we need to get to? Are we really clear on that vivid and sort of instructive picture of what a successful future looks like? What are we going towards here? And not just what are we going towards in terms of scale, in terms of dimensionalizing that, but what kind of outcome? Are we looking to own this like an Italian leather goods firm and it's
Mm.
going to be a generational family business that we hand down to our grandchildren? Are we going to look to list on the stock exchange and become a public company? Are we going to look to be acquired by private equity, or are we going to look to a industry? Like, what is success? Where are we heading? And then you start to build a theory of growth towards that. What is it? What's it going to take realistically? There's a wonderful way of thinking about change called transformative scenario planning, which sort of says, look, if you're trying to figure out how to get off the couch and run a marathon, don't start by visualizing yourself on the couch. Begin by crossing the finishing line.
Mhm.
Work backwards. Well, if I just ran through the finishing line of the Boston Marathon in 4 hours, what must have just happened in the last month and in the last year? And then you work back and you work back and you go, okay, this is doable, but starting today, I need to do these things. If we just sit there on the couch and think, well, I'm this guy on the couch, I'm underfit and overweight, and I've never run more than 5 kilometers or 3 miles in my life, crossing that finish line in 4 hours seems impossible. So you sort of get this sense of success and you work back and you start to build a theory of what's it going to take to grow that business. And that's when you then flip to the brand growth piece. So the brand growth piece says, okay, even if I could build that business, even if I could make that widget and get it manufactured in China and I could, plug it into supply chains and I could master the challenges of operations and logistics and have enough cash flow, how would I make people want me to be successful? How would I engage consumers? How would I create feeling? This is the genius, and I sort of hate to reach for people like Apple because none of us are Apple, none of us are
Yeah.
Steve Jobs.
Yeah.
Look at the genius of someone like Steve Jobs, and yes, it was a unicorn moment. And going, Apple in the early 2000s, predominantly still a computer manufacturer, making iMacs and MacBooks, and visualizing this world of not just iPods, but iPhones and iPads and AirPods, and wanting to own our technology lives. And Steve Jobs looking and going, you know what? The way we have retailed in the past is not how we're going to be successful in the future. And he took billions of dollars out of Apple's cash reserves and marketing budgets and put that instead into building a global network of
Yeah.
stores. And we could not imagine the Apple of today without that network. Elon Musk, not my favorite person on some levels, but goodness me, extraordinary with that sense of vision. Tesla, not just going, how do we change the economics
Yeah.
of EVs and get the cost of batteries down? But we are personally going to take responsibility for building nationwide networks of fast chargers to ease people's range anxiety. The theory of brand growth really asks, how are we going to create the feelings and the emotions and the behavioral nudges and shifts that will drive our success? And when you lean into that second question, you start to figure out, why is this going to be expensive? So when you combine that theory of business growth and that theory of brand growth, what you're starting to do is get really realistic. And I'm not saying this is like Edward de Bono putting on the black hat and getting really pessimistic. We're not trying to find all the reasons we will fail. We're trying to find all the difficult things we will need to do to succeed. And when we find that full laundry list of difficult things on the business side and the brand side, we're starting to get realistic about, what is this going to cost? And cost maybe talent, cost maybe we need more people, cost maybe money, cost
Mhm.
maybe fees, cost may mean we have to give up a lot of equity to bring in that money or bring in that expertise. Cost may be that we need to sell our home, and because we're going to have to go on the road, because actually this is only going to work if we travel with it. What we discover with those theories are what the true cost of success are going to be. And with that, suddenly what felt like difficult decisions, like giving up equity, become easy decisions. Because if I don't do this thing, we simply will not be successful.
So you talked about in some ways starting thinking about the finish line, right, with the marathon analogy there. Uh, did you and your two partners talk about the finish line? At what point did that even come up, right, in building this thing? And by the ways, there's three of you, so you have to agree on, an exit strategy. Which, for those that don't know, in 2019, you sold 50% of the company to Lion, I think it is, right, a big conglomerate. Then a few years later, the other 50%. So there was an exit at some point, but when did that come up in conversation?
It came up right at the beginning, but it came up with the right volume level.
Mm,
And what I mean by that is there are two forms of success. Like, I know you've had an incredible diversity of people on this podcast, and you might have an athlete on, and I think it's, that athlete is going to have a sense of the position they want to play in the game, and maybe the team they want to get to, and the major finals they want to play. And they probably don't necessarily know that at the end of that athletic career they want to become a coach, or they want to
mhm.
become a team owner. Or, like, you don't need to know everything, but you need to know enough.
Yeah.
And for us, the main thing we needed to know was, what does this business look like when it is fully grown and mature? And so, if as three co-founders, there was a fundamental difference of opinion, because Matt wants to build effectively a packaged goods business and scale and scale and scale and scale and scale, and Cameron wants to create a beautiful artisanal small batch cottage business, then it doesn't matter about the exit. We are going to fracture long before the exit, because fundamentally we are trying to build different businesses.
Mm.
The first level of alignment is simply on, are we trying to build the same business towards the same material reality here? Because we raised investment, because we were putting our own money into it, you also have to ask with honesty, what outcome are we trying to seek for this investment that we've raised?
Yeah.
What kind of, if it's going to be raining for a while, but what kind of sunny uplands are we trying to take
Mhm.
towards? It wasn't just the the three blokes who invested in this, all six sort of spouses were heavily involved and invested. This wasn't a flight of fancy from the three boys and the three girls are sitting on the sidelines. They all lent in as well. So the six of us, and we all had small kids when we started. So the six of us are aware, like we're borrowing from our bank accounts, we're mortgaging against our homes, we're borrowing from time we could have spent with our kids. What return are we getting? What return are we going to give to our investors? So I think you have to think about that second piece enough to again make sure that you're aligned. And
Mm.
it's difficult if Greg says, "Well, I was planning on handing this down to my kids," and Matt says, "Yeah, but surely we need to find an equity partner at some stage." Well, again, we have tension. So
Right.
alignment is really, really critical. What I would say though is between those two conversations, it's a classic 80-20. 80% of the alignment needed to be on what is the business we're trying to build. Because frankly, if we spend every day trying to build a great business, we were going to make the asset that was the business more attractive to other people. If we spent 80% of our time always talking about, are we getting closer to an exit? We wouldn't have been focused enough on the quality of the business and the brand that we were building. So alignment critical, alignment on the business more important than on the exit, but even from the early stages, important just to get a little bit of a sense of, yeah, but are we broadly aligned? And I sometimes think about it as, I met my wife, we were pretty young when we met and young when we got married. We were a long way from choosing to have kids. But it was just good to know when we got married that
Yes.
we're probably long-term aligned, that kids are something we see in our future.
Yeah.
Let's get aligned on that now. We don't need to talk about it for another 8 years. But
Right.
we broadly know we're heading in that direction. I think it's similar when you go into a partnership. Are we broadly aligned that this is the kind of outcome that appeals to all of us? Yep, good. Okay, now let's focus on living our lives. Now let's focus on building the best business we can. But it is useful to know that long term, there's an outcome that we're aligned on as well.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. So when it comes time to sell 50% of it, was that decision to reap some benefit, right? Take some risk off the table, and then continue to build and have some upside? Was that the thinking?
I think so, and I think there are two thoughts. So the first is just the bird in the hand thought that by this time we've got those original 20 investors. We called them Ginvestors because we thought that was fun. We pretty much we got sick of putting G's in front of IN words pretty soon.
Yeah,
I think
yeah,
Ginspiration and
yeah.
Ginnovation kind of killed it for us, but Ginvestors stuck. And when we did a second raise, only 18 months in, I think 18 of those 20 doubled down. The other two held their position. And we invited another about 15 investors into the fold. So fast forward to 2019, we've got about 35 people with a small stake in Four Pillars. It felt like a really nice time to be able to give all of them a good day. So
Hmm.
even if the three co-founders, we felt it was a job half done, there was this bird in the hand opportunity to give those people who'd shown faith in us a good day. And that felt really good and really satisfying. The bigger thing, though, well, not the bigger thing, but the thing that probably then had more material effect on the next few years goes back to this notion of risk and alignment. And I think one of the misalignments that's always a risk is misalignment between founders, between partners. But another misalignment that is a risk is the misalignment between your risk appetite as a founder and the risk requirement of the business. So one of the things that I reflect on a lot is that whenever we are starting up something, whether we are starting a podcast or a business or a career, to some extent, the first sales we make, the first gains we make are actually the easiest ones. If you're selling cookies when you're in primary school, the first cookies you probably sell are to your parents.
Yeah.
The first doors you knock on are friendly neighbors. Where it gets difficult is when you have to push outside of that comfort zone.
Mhm.
And then even once you've conquered that, that still doesn't get you to meaningful scale. But at least at that stage, you've now got some momentum. You've got some runs on the board. So I think sometimes startup founders think the hardest bit will be the beginning, but actually I think it's the middle. And
Hmm.
in that middle, the bets are starting to get bigger. The risks you need to take are starting to get greater. you have less control, less certainty that everything is going to come off. And suddenly you're having to make bets and take risks of a whole different quantum. And I think that's what we started to see. So are we really going to be a brand that exports to 20, 25, 30 markets worldwide? In 2019, we were the ninth biggest gin brand worldwide in travel retail. That's airport stores, airport duty free.
Yeah.
Not huge in America because you guys don't pay much duty. So
Mhm.
people don't, in Australia, in Europe, in Asia, absolutely enormous business. We're the ninth biggest brand globally in that. Now,
Wow.
that's a really expensive environment to grow in. If you can succeed there, it's a phenomenal brand building opportunity. If you've got, as we do today, beautiful big displays in Changi Airport in Singapore, all of Asia is moving through that. So you're not just selling product, you're building brand equity while you do it. These are unicorn opportunities, but they're really expensive. So are we going to do that? The growth becomes to some extent pay to play, and we're trying to hold on to those luxury principles, those premium principles. So we don't want to discount. We want to do everything beautifully, and we want to do everything all at once, everything everywhere all at once. It's like the movie. And you don't want to have to say no to any opportunity. And so you get to this point of going, the business's need is greater than our individual appetite for risk.
Yeah.
And so at that stage, I think you've got to have the humility to go, maybe we need a bigger boat and we need to invite some other people to help us build that bigger boat. We wanted to expand our distillery. We were getting regularly 90,000 people a year visiting Four Pillars. Unfortunately, 75 of that 90,000 visited on Saturdays and Sundays.
Yeah.
People were queuing for up to an hour in a regional town in the middle of a wine region, an hour outside of Melbourne, and people were driving there and then waiting an hour to get in. This is insane. It's like Disneyland. So we need a bigger boat. We need to
Yeah.
build a bigger distillery. We want a physical home in Sydney. We want beautiful displays in travel retail stores around the world. All of this is capital. So the money we raised, we sold some equity. We gave our investors a good day. Um, we three co-founders sort of got our initial investments back and were able to, get rid of the extra mortgages on our homes.
Uh-huh.
Really key things. The two key things we secured from Lion, who were in turn the parent company is Kirin, one of the big global drinks companies out of Japan, and Lion was their Australian arm. The two things we secured were 4 years of operational freedom. You guys will invest, you'll buy 50% of the equity, but we three co-founders will remain operationally 100% in charge for the next 4 years. Yes, we'll have a board. Matt's going to chair the board. We will be a 50-50 board. So if we're ever gridlocked on anything, we just go back to plan and we get to keep running the show.
Yeah.
And we want you guys to make a very, very significant capital investment. We're not asking you to subsidize our operating expenses. We're not asking you to fund Super Bowl ads, but we want to build bricks and mortar. We want to build digital infrastructure. We want to make really significant long-term capital investments, and you're going to fund them. And so we use that moment strategically to give the business what we three
Yeah.
co-founders couldn't give it, and also strategically to take a bit of risk off the table so that we as leaders could be bolder. And in that moment, we almost shifted from co-founders to co-CEOs. Stu and I both stepped down from our consulting businesses and went full-time into Four Pillars and went, okay, full commitment. And the little bit of serendipity. And there are many sliding doors moments in careers, business, and if we're lucky, the right door opens at the right time and we make the decision to walk through it. Of course, the great sliding door was then COVID. And COVID was this enormous disruption that none of us saw. It hit our industry 10 months after we did the deal with Lion. And it meant that we then were able to navigate. And no one is grateful that COVID showed up. It was
Yeah.
devastating to mental health. It was devastating to the hospitality industry. It was devastating to a lot of craft producers and devastating to all sorts of sectors, more profound than the spirit sector. However, we always felt quite blessed and fortunate about was that we had made a decision that to some extent de-risked the business, meant we had a big brother standing behind us,
Yeah.
and meant them make bold long-term decisions and stay on course rather than freaking out and starting to make very short-term decisions. So we were able to keep all of our staff in the boat. We went we went close to 2 years without making a single person redundant. We managed to keep everyone whose casual shifts were lost on the front line. We kept redeploying them. We managed to stay focused on the long term, keep our people together, take care of people, take care of the brand. And maybe we could not have made those wise long term
Yeah,
decisions had we had more risk and tension. So sometimes you don't even know the wisdom of the
sure.
decisions.
Yeah. Yeah, that's certainly a key part, of the story. So, they now own 100%. Are you still involved in the product?
So I faded out like an 80s song. I stayed on for 12 months after they acquired the equity to advise on brand, and then I sort of continued to advise in the background. But it's a little bit like selling a house. You might pop back from time to time and sort of
Yeah,
tell them how to take care of the garden and make sure the flowers don't die. But fundamentally, someone else has bought your house now, and you've got to accept the decisions they make and do so with grace and with happiness. So I'm now just a massive cheerleader for the gin from the sidelines. You know, they'll always take my calls, and I'll always take their calls, and I'll offer my advice if and when they want it. But
yeah,
you know, get to be in that really privileged position of talking to people about what we built and talking about how we built it. And I got to write a book called Lessons from Gin. And I do a lot of keynote speaking and do a bit of advising and get to sit on wonderful podcasts like this and yeah, just get to cheer them along from the sidelines.
yeah. Well, it sounds like, I mean, it was kind of gradual, the progression. Some sales, of course, are very much more abrupt, and then the founder may feel a sense of loss, at that, right? Because you built this thing, it was your baby, and now you don't control it. Yours sounded a little bit more gradual, and probably that made the transition away from that identity as founder probably a little easier.
100%. And I think, you don't always get to choose your acquirer, but in our case, we did quite carefully pick who we wanted to talk to and who we wanted to go further with, and they were people who we felt valued a few things that are important to us. We could have tried to be acquired by a global drinks business like a Diageo or a Bacardi, and then
Mhm.
potentially they might have deprioritized the Australian market and said, well, Belgium and Mexico are more important to us. And
Right.
then our home market could have got hollowed out. Whereas we went with someone who we felt valued craft and valued Australia and valued the way we did things. And so by extension, those people are going to value your input. They're going to want you involved for longer. They're going to want your contribution. So I think we designed for that to an extent. But you were also correct. You form an identity. I think the thing for me that I take away most strongly from it is that I do a lot of writing, and I wrote the other day about how great businesses don't distinguish between business thinking and brand thinking because they realize there is no line between business thinking and brand thinking. They're just two sides of the same coin. But often, unfortunately, businesses are making business decisions, finance decisions, operations decisions, and then separately brand decisions and marketing decisions. They're making them in different rooms. And so by definition,
Yeah.
decisions are not coming from the same place. And the wonderful privilege we had as being co-founders and co-CEOs of a business is we were the room. So there was no line. There was only one room. And every decision we made was seen through the lens of to what extent does this serve the business? To what extent does this serve the brand? And that probably is going to be the thing that I find hardest to now replace. And I do a lot of speaking about it and I do a lot of advisory work. And what I'm always trying to do is encourage people to erase the line and bring those rooms together and think of these decisions as one set of decisions. But that's going to be the thing that I miss the most, that wonderful opportunity to build a business that thinks I was going to say thinks in the right ways, but actually what I mean is thinks in the ways that we believe are right.
Mm. Mhm. Yeah, a good distinction. Um, it's a success story, there's no doubt about it from beginning to end. Is there anything you would do differently looking back? And maybe not because it, it ended pretty well. But when you look back and if you were advising, an entrepreneur today, do you look back and say, "I probably would have pivoted there or done something a little differently?"
So first of all, thank you. Yeah, I think it is a success story, and one doesn't wish to sound sort of arrogant or hubristic, but from a business point of view, you start a little gin business in a country that has no reputation for gin. Every right to make great gin. Australia, anyone who's enjoyed a flat white and some avocado on toast or come and spent time in Sydney or Melbourne realizes that the food and flavor culture of Australia is extraordinary.
Mm,
No one had really thought to turn that into gin. So the opportunity was there, but the demand was not. So to go from that to being named the world's leading gin producer 3 times was a credit to the quality of the business and the product. And then on a brand side and a sales side, we started with that $30,000 crowdfunding campaign. In the last year of full ownership, we sold $35 million worth of gin. That's by any measure extraordinary growth. We're not quite a SaaS, unicorn with a hockey stick growth curve, but for
yeah.
people manufacturing batch by batch, bottle by bottle, that was extraordinary growth. And so on the one hand, you say, well, there's not much you do differently because happy days. There were many possible outcomes we could have had. And the one we got was way at the top of the list. Maybe if you had a magic wand, you would make COVID not happen. But a better answer to your question is the one thing I would do differently is we had this magical moment at the start of Four Pillars when we realized that we knew just enough to want to do this, but not enough to do it well. And Stu and Cam went to the States. They came over the US and they started in Seattle and they drove all the way down to Los Angeles and they visited about 30 different distilleries. Some were gin distilleries, some were distilleries that made lots of spirit. And every time they tasted a gin that was just phenomenal, they would go around the back because normally these weren't like beautiful visitor centers. They were just some shed somewhere, and they'd go around the back and they'd find a still. And they thought the stills were always called Carl. They're like, why do Americans name all their stills Carl? Then they realized actually Carl was the name of the still maker, Christian Carl of Germany.
Mm,
So they come back to Australia and they say, Matt, yep, confirmed. Our road trip, our fact-finding mission, our road trip has confirmed this is a good idea. We should definitely make gin. We should make gin in Australian style. Guess what? The Americans aren't making traditional British London gin. They're doing their own thing. We should do the same. Oh, and by the way, we've got to spend a lot of money on a car still. Now, that led to a lot of the stuff that we've talked about in this podcast, the need to raise money. But it also led to us having to pause for a moment and take a breath because it was going to take 12 months from ordering to this car still landing in Australia and being ready to go. And that moment of pause was an absolute gift. We live in a world now where there is this hustle culture, this
mhm,
bravado, this sense that if you're not executing 20 strategies before breakfast, you're not succeeding.
mhm,
We're supposed to be constantly in motion, taking action. We actually need to slow down and think more. We need to slow down so we can then speed up. And it's very easy. Often think of launching a business like trying to take off a plane. We can take that plane off and we can be bumping around in the clouds at like 3,000 feet. The job was to spend more time on the ground.
yeah,
So we built ourselves a big old Airbus A380 that can get to 38,000 feet. Like that's, and
yeah,
then maybe we want to turn it into a rocket and get a moonshot going on. But just getting the plane up in the air quickly was not the point. That moment of pause was incredibly important. There were probably a few moments on our journey when maybe we would have benefited from pausing some more. I'm not saying I would do it differently, but the one permission I would have given myself, and if I was sort of reaching back into the past
yeah,
and tapping myself on the shoulder, don't be afraid to have an occasional moment of pause where even though it feels like you're on this running machine that's just going faster and faster and faster, don't be afraid occasionally to step off because it will be okay. You've built enough momentum that you don't need to keep moving those little legs as fast as they can. Maybe another moment of pause to reflect on how you're doing this and how this business is growing and causing yourself to adjust. That's the one thing I maybe would the little wise word I would pass back. Maybe we wouldn't have done anything differently, but it would never have hurt us to take a moment of reflection, to deepen that self understanding. There's a wonderful leadership writer from the States called Marshall Goldsmith, and he wrote a book a long time ago called What Got You Here Won't Get You There. And I think one of the challenges for us in our careers, in our businesses, whatever we're trying to do, is we tend to keep trading off the stuff that got us here
Right.
because we give ourselves long enough to think about the possibility that what got us here is not going to get us there.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
that's the one thing to change a tiny, tiny bit.
That's
But
great.
I wouldn't change the outcome.
That is, yeah, of course, of course. But that is such a great answer, Matt. I mean, that you've reflected on this career and this story, and I think people can gain a lot from that. They can gain from your book too, lessons from Jen. So you have the book out there, which I'll put a link in our notes. And what else are you doing now, and how can people follow you?
So LinkedIn, if you sort of punch in Matt Jones and gin, I'm the first bald white dude who shows up on that. I've got a little advisory firm called Think Store Experience, which I named after, as I said early on in the podcast, I guess the skill sets, the toolbox that I try and carry around with me. So thinkstoreexperience.com is a little bit about me and what I do. And I try and give as many keynotes as I can. I enjoy speaking. I do a little bit of advisory work, some of it for, I mentor startups and some of it for, long in the tooth CEOs and founders who are trying to figure out where the next scale is going to come from. And I try and write when I can. I'm actually sort of currently trying to figure out Substack. So,
Yeah.
there's always a next frontier of trying to share knowledge and talk to people and as my dad would have urged me, just try and keep finding ways to add some value.
Yeah, well, keep writing because the writing's good, and I've been following that. So, and I would say, you have a teenage daughter. I have two teenage daughters. One's 18; she's a freshman in college, and she wants the roadmap. She wants every step of the way, and I try to encourage her that you can't have it all figured out, right? Because that's life, right? We take these turns, and I think about that with your story and how you started off as economist, and then the political thing, and then the branding, and this through line led you to this place, and you collected experiences along the way, right? And you had this growth mindset along the way and kept building on that, and all those little stops along the way prepared you for this journey into the gin company, and here's the outcome. So I hope people can take that from this. And I think that's a great part of your story, is connecting all those dots.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I feel very, very fortunate to have had the support, talking about being a parent, having the support from my parents in the early days that meant when the choice was, what's the thing that's going to pay me the most money next? Or what's the thing that's going to be most interesting? And it
Mhm.
turns out choosing the interesting thing meant choosing the thing that added another string to my bow, added another chapter to my story, added another skill set and another tool I could deploy in the future. So rather than monetizing what I had to the maximum effect, my parents supporting me enough to go, no, you know what? You want to go and play in politics? Go and play in politics. You want to move
Mhm.
to Australia? Move to Australia. We've got your back. Go and do that. And ultimately, that ability to take appropriate risk and, to your point, have that growth mindset. You might not think of it as a growth mindset, but that effectively is what it is. And, hopefully you get lucky and, the right sliding doors open and you choose to walk through the right ones and, you end up with a good outcome.
That's great. Well, thanks for taking the time today. Appreciate it. And it's a great story. I'm sure people can learn a lot from it. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Craig. Love the chat.